It was the last time I see my daughter alive.
Her family is desperate for answers.
Where could she go? What happened to her? Who did she go with if she did go with somebody? I yelled at the gate, "Peter, I'm here, shelter, come out," and nothing. The dogs are barking. Someone looks through the window, they close it. That's what scared me a lot.
All of a sudden, I felt that something bad happened to her. I could feel it in my gut.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Pepita's last known steps.
Human trafficking does happen in Albuquerque.
We're less than 500 miles from the border. We're at the intersection of two interstate highway systems. We have cartels engaged in moving human beings.
That's what made me afraid of, what if? I'm not giving up. We're gonna find you, one way or the other. If we have to wait forever, then we will.
The more people who know Pepita's story, the greater the chance of bringing her home.
I am Pepita Red Hair's mother. Pepita, my daughter, she's a loving, kind person. She always texts me maybe 3 times a day. Even though she was living in her boyfriend's house south of Albuquerque, she would always message me, "Good night, Mom." The last time I seen my daughter was Tuesday morning, March 24th, 2020. Pepita came home for a visit. She was living in Albuquerque, but she still liked to come home, spend a day with us. Pepita was 5 years old when we moved into Crown Point, New Mexico, and that's where she was raised.
My name is Shelda Livingston. I am Pepita Red Hair's sister. Crown Point is on a small Navajo reservation. There's a lot of property, not a lot of job options there in Crown Point. Pepita was an adventurous person. She's always doing different things. She never sat still. She liked to go skateboarding a lot. She said it was an adrenaline rush for her. She always talked about how she wanted to make a name for herself. Pepita was determined to leave home and get a career. After high school, she moved to Albuquerque. In the year of 2016, Pepita met Nick, and they started a relationship. They would hug each other constantly, or they would tell each other, "I love you." Pepita moved into Nick's parents' home in Albuquerque about 5 or 6 months after they started dating. Prior to Nick, Pepita did date a gentleman, and he was Mexican, and they did, share different cultures, and she did learn a lot from him. However, with Nick, I'm pretty sure they talked about the traditions of Navajo. Early on in the relationship, Pepita called me and questioned me about a Navajo wedding and how the ceremony goes. Questions about what to do, how to do it, what needs to be done. I figured, wow, she really is happy with this guy. They're thinking about marriage. This could be a good thing for her. He did tell her, I'm gonna work and, provide all this for you. We're gonna get our own home, a lot of promises. So I believe that, that was the one that she wants to spend the rest of her life with. She was happy.
On March 25th of 2020, I didn't receive no text from Pepita. And I did text her. I said, "Are you okay? Please call me. Let me know everything's fine." There's nothing all day. On Friday the 27th, it's been 2 days. I did text her again, "Sweetie, where are you? Please call me." There's no text, no Facebook Messenger, no phone calls from her. I called her boyfriend, Nick, and I asked him, Nick, please call me or text me where Pepita is. And he goes, I don't know, she left. Us Native American are very close. She wouldn't be gone that long without her texting me, contacting her sister, her brother, and her nieces. I love my children deep from my heart, and I knew something was wrong.
When my mom, Anita, did call me about my sister, Pepita, and she was like, hey, Shelda, this is happening. I can't reach your sister. That's when I found out. I just thinking all kinds of things. Where would she go? What happened to her? Just all kinds of questions go through your mind.
All of a sudden, I felt that something bad happened to her. I could feel it in my gut. So right away, I jump on the phone. I call Albuquerque Bernalillo Police Department. That's when I talked to the detective. I said, I want to find my daughter.
One of the officers told her, Pepita is an adult. She has a right to be missing. Maybe she's just at a friend's house. She'll pop up in a week or two, so don't worry. We decided we're not gonna wait. We decided to look for her. Central and San Pedro is right here. This is where we looked. We started from where she hung out, where we knew she knew a lot of people. That's where we started from. She did ride the bus a lot, so we started hitting the bus stop. We also put flyers there for her. Making the flyers was difficult because money-wise, my mom was a single parent. She pays all the bills on her own. I am also a single mother of 3. But we did have family members donate money to help doing the flyers and getting more copies. So majority of the times we're posting it on the doors or putting it into people's mailboxes in the neighborhood around Nick's home. I would talk to those people and hand out flyers and let them know, hey, my sister's still missing. A lot of them would say, oh yeah, I remember her. She's very friendly. And they would always tell me, no, we haven't seen her. Is she really missing? A lot of them from the beginning were in disbelief because she's always around.
My name is Sean Griswold. I'm a reporter with Source New Mexico. The timing for Pepita's disappearance was unfortunate. She went missing on March 24th, 2020, and shortly after, the COVID pandemic shut down almost the entire world.
My name is Darlene Gomez, and I am Pepita Redhair's family's advocate. When I first met Anita King, she was very defeated. Some of the problems that the Albuquerque Police Department was facing is that it was COVID. They stopped all face-to-face investigations. They had a lot of police officers who were out sick.
They just kept telling us the same thing. Because of the pandemic, we can't do anything. We're shutting down, and she'll come up in a week or two. That was their only answer to us. My mom was persistent. She kept calling the officers and saying, I know something happened. Can you please do something? But they just kept telling my mom, you have to wait.
Police operations were essentially halted because of COVID. But the family also feels as if the follow-up was still not there and that police don't care about Pepita. The family alleges that there's racism with the department. Racial discrimination in the Albuquerque Police Department is a fact. We have a federal Department of Justice that reviews the police's relationship with communities of color and has shown there's a systemic problem going back decades. and I've definitely experienced it myself. Pepita is Navajo and I'm Pueblo. So yeah, we're both Native American, and so it's personal for me.
I do believe because Pepita was Native American, that really impacted how Albuquerque Police Department probably looked at her case. If it was a white woman and her parents said she is gone, this is not like her, do I think some more resources would have been put into place? Most definitely.
I was so frustrated. I was upset. I was mad.
When Pepita's family members realized that the Albuquerque police were not offering much help, Anita then tried to go to the Navajo Nation police. But the issue there, of course, is that Pepita's case happened in Albuquerque. Jurisdictionally, the Navajo Nation police can't do anything about it. The Albuquerque Police Department is responsible for the investigation of her disappearance, and they're the only police agency that should be investigating this case.
I started calling the news station to come and help us. I did reach out to them to ask them, hey, can you put up her picture on your show so we can put the word out there? And they're like, well, we're sorry, we can't help you at this time. I was livid. I said, you guys do it for other people. You guys did it for so-and-so. And I said, you can't do it for my sister? I said, it's only 5 seconds of your time I'm asking for it.
Maybe they just didn't want to do a missing person story that day because everything was dominated by COVID coverage. Or they deemed Pepita's case as not newsworthy. Cases involving missing Native women or murdered Native women don't get any attention. How many people know Native Americans? How many people have ever met a Navajo in person? How many people have a judgment and bias against somebody that they think is other than them?
That's when we realized, okay, we have to do this on our own. When we didn't hear from her, at that point, I thought maybe she's still in Nick's house. Maybe he's holding her in there. So I drove to Nick's house. This is Nick's house. It's gonna be right here. So this is where my mom dropped off Pepita, March 24, 2020. I remember I yelled at the gate, Peta, I'm here, it's Shelta, come out. You know, Nick, if you're in there, come out and talk to me. Where's Peta? Peta, you know, we're here. I'm here trying to look for you. Where are you? And nothing. The dogs are barking. Someone looks through the window, they close it. That's what scared me a lot. Nobody comes out.
My daughter Pepita, her boyfriend Nick is Native American. The first time I met him, I said, please take care of my daughter. She's a loving, kind person.
I was happy with Pepita dating Nick because I saw them, you know, be an affectionate couple. Pepita was very happy with Nick. She was always calling and saying, hey, this is what we're gonna do. We're going to go watch a movie. She was always outgoing and optimistic. Her willingness to do anything for him, always being there. That's the whole of her personality that drew Nick in.
But then one day, Pepita told me that Nick hit her. She said Nick just got out of control with his drinking. Pepita told me that she was in an abusive relationship.
I told her, you know, you can't be with somebody that does this. Once they do it, they'll always do it again.
I try to, you know, encourage my daughter to, you know, stay home, just move back. But she said, Mom, there's nothing here. I want to go back and be with Nick. She said, I love him.
Native American women, on average, have the highest rates of domestic violence. 1 in 2 Native American women will face some type of violent situation in their life. whether that's a domestic violence situation, whether they're assaulted, whether they're kidnapped, or they're murdered. And so it's present in our community.
On the day of my mom dropping Pepita back off at Nick's home, Pepita reassured my mom.
She goes, Mom, I love you. Take care of yourself. Drive home safe. It was the last time I see my daughter alive.
Because of all of the issues that were leading up to Pepita's disappearance, this is why the family has this idea that Nick had a role to play in her disappearance. All they know is that Pepita is missing, and to their knowledge, she was the last person that saw her.
To my knowledge today, Nick has never been convicted of any type of violent crime. And because I don't have a complete file for Nick, then I can't tell you if there was any allegations of domestic violence. But what I can tell you is that there was numerous calls about domestic violence to the home, and that Nick's family members lived there as well. On 2/6/2020, there was a domestic disturbance, 12/24/2015 domestic disturbance. I know that she was hospitalized a few times, looking back at medical records.
From the beginning of my sister Pepita being missing, even during the pandemic, I believe that Nick should have been questioned thoroughly. An investigation should have opened, at least in a walk through the home, checking the home, look for anything out of the ordinary.
The police had told me that Nick was interviewed once. And I think it's safe to say at this moment that Nick is not a suspect in this case. There hasn't been an adequate response at all from police as to why Nick is not a suspect. Other than that, he's not a suspect. Plain and simple, that's all they say.
The position of the Albuquerque Police Department is that they do not believe that Nick is involved in any type of foul play, and that they have done everything possible to properly investigate this case, so they're going to continue to leave it as a missing person case.
The family, they're very desperate to find anything. So they've organized the foot search near Pepita's home.
This is where we started our footwork search. The West Mesa area in Albuquerque, it is desert, just sand, and there's hills that go up and down. There's a lot of bushes, rocks, holes, caves, ditches. If you were to try to hide a body, that would be a perfect place because it's in a remote area. We did also ask the police, can we get cadaver dogs? And they told us that people do dump big items of trash in the mesa. When we were doing our search, when we seen trash bags, we kind of opened it, and of course we use rubber gloves and we use sticks to move things around to see if we find anything. And that's kind of what we worked with.
How does it make you feel to think that your sister could be out here right now? And she may have ended the last moments of her life out here.
It's really hard to even think about it, but it's something that we need to think about. Worst case scenario, she could be anywhere in this area. It's very heartbreaking not knowing what happened, and it's heartbreaking for me knowing we weren't there to help her, you know.
On April 19th, 2020, nearly a month after Pepita goes missing, her boyfriend Nick files a missing persons report with police in Albuquerque.
So the documents that I do have in my hand are the original missing persons report that was filed by Nick to the Albuquerque Police Department. What Nicholas said was Pepita and him had an argument and she left on foot. Nicholas said that he had received a text message and that text said that she was with a gentleman by the name of Laramie.
I asked police, was there any effort to find this Laramie person? Or if they contacted or if they know or have located Laramie, and I got no response to that. Other than that, he's not a suspect. It's very strange. There's a lot of issues here that police have yet to quite respond to. And ultimately, you just wonder, do they think they dropped the ball? Like, are they able to consider that perhaps they messed this case up? I don't think they would ever publicly admit it.
I didn't know the guy. It's the first time I heard about Laramie. I think Nick is lying.
I told my mom, put it on Facebook. Say, hey, this is the last person that Nick claims Pepita was with at the time. Does anybody know Laramie? Put him on Facebook and let it go, see what happens with it.
Oh, I had hopes. I had good feeling that he's going to give the information of what happened. You know, oh, wow, it's going to work this time. They're going to find her.
Laramie did get a hold of my mom. He basically told my mom, I did know Pepita, but I am not with your daughter. I don't know where she is. The last time he saw Pepita was March 10, 2020, on his birthday, because Pepita bought him a cupcake and sang happy birthday to him. He said she was with Nick. Nick started getting upset with Peta that she did buy a birthday cupcake for Laramie. So they started arguing. Laramie stated that he did see Nick strike Pepita. Laramie said he just left because he didn't want to cause any more problems. That was the last time he saw Pepita.
After talking to the Albuquerque Police Department detectives working on this case, it's my understanding that contact had not been made with Laramie. It's my belief that they did not look into Laramie's Facebook account, cell phone records, so I don't believe that they were able to determine if she was indeed with Laramie. What I believe is that during that period of time, Pepita's family was not contacted at all. And there does not appear like there was any movement as far as getting warrants, and that the initial detective was getting ready to retire. So I believe that the case sat basically unlooked at.
I was so livid with everything that was going on with the officers. It would have been nice if they would have got a statement from Laramie. Unfortunately, Laramie's deceased now, so it's a little late to ask him questions. The things they could have done from the beginning, the evidence they could have found, it's gone.
How did she feel?
Very bad. Very bad. We still haven't found any answers, any leads. And that got me mad and it got me sad. On May 20th, my mom did get a phone call from a young female stating that she did see Pepita. All the girl told us was, hey, Pepita is here at City Park. Click. That's all we had to go with. I dropped everything I was doing and I left, and I didn't bother, like following the speed limit or anything. I just said, okay, well, let's go. We gotta find her. Well, let's hurry and get there as fast as we can. It was an adrenaline rush. I was excited. I was like, maybe she is at the park. Maybe they did find her. Or God forbid, maybe somebody left her there. I did not know what we were getting into. Our hope was just, it is her. It's her. Let's go get her. When we drove to this first place we thought City Park was. I looked around the park. There was a couple drinking, and she had her back turned. I ran to her. PETA, I started yelling her name from a distance, but there was no response. So I approached them, and clearly it was not PETA. I had a flyer, so I showed them, and they're like, no, we don't know who she is. We don't know her, I'm sorry. So I looked through the rest of the park. No sign of her. She's not here. So then I started thinking, go back on the Google and look for City Park, see if we're missing anything else. So when I Googled City Park on Google Map, it was kind of odd. The icon on the map, it showed a spot in the middle of a hotel that said City Park, but that's not what the hotel was called. I said, what the is this? I was like, well, screw it, let's just go over there. I pulled in here, and if you look to the left, when you first drive in, there's a tree right there. There was a young gentleman on a bicycle on his walkie-talkie, watching everyone coming in. Very odd for someone to be watching the entrance of a hotel. The other one was over here by the trash dump. He was sitting there on his bicycle with the walkie-talkie. The third gentleman was standing right here by the tree with his bike also, and he also had a walkie-talkie. And I was like, that's weird. 3 guys around the motel sitting there just watching us. And they're watching everything that we did. And we continued to drive through here. We didn't see anyone outside at the time. There's no sign of her. PETA's not there. But there was vans lined up all the way right here. All the way up to maybe like right here. Different license plates throughout the state. And the vans were with dark tinted windows, no logos on the vans. I'm scared. I didn't feel comfortable being there. The vibe that you get from that place is not good. And we just left. What scared me a lot was that I know that human trafficking does happen in Albuquerque. That's what made me afraid of, what if?
My name's Raul Torres. I'm the Bernalillo County District Attorney. My office has been involved in the recovery of people who've been the victims of human trafficking. We're less than 500 miles from the border. We're at the intersection of 2 interstate highway systems. We have cartels who we know are engaged not only in smuggling firearms and narcotics, they're also engaged in moving human beings, trading them, and using them oftentimes in the sex trade or for basically indentured service to other people.
Pepita could very well be a victim of human trafficking. We ultimately don't know. When there's so little information that's come out of this case, you start to speculate on every scenario.
I just prayed for her, that she's safe.
It's heartbreaking to know that she's still out there. We don't know what shape she's in. We don't know if she's okay. We're looking for answers, and we won't give up on her. We just want her home.
Pepita Redhair was last seen on March 24th, 2020. If you have any information, please contact Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office at 505-222-1101.
At the end of May, Pepita had been missing for more than 2 months. And the family was able to contact Nick and arrange a time to pick up her belongings at the house.
I do have Pepita's clothes here. This is a set of clothes that Pepita was wearing over the weekend before she went missing.
The family had an idea that by putting her belongings in a plastic bag, Maybe this could be used as evidence or could be turned over to police. This is just an assumption that they made, and it's not quite sure if that's ever going to happen or ever did happen.
And there's a t-shirt, a black t-shirt in here, and a black pair of jeans. This bag of clothes of Pepita. Just makes you wonder where she is. Where are you? I'm home. What happened to you? All the questions when I pick up this bag. The questions you want to ask. We just want closure. We want her home. I did take my sister's clothes to the medicine man to do a Navajo ceremony. What they do is they do a fire. And then from the fire, it's called teat. It turns into ash. Before it turns into ash, the medicine man removes it, and they use that smoke to see the scene of a loved one. Through singing and chanting, and then the smoke going out, they have the ability to find out if she's still on Earth or if she's not on Earth, and where she could be. He did tell us that she is still living, but she's being held against her will. She's in a dark room, is all he saw, and all she does is write. I don't know what I felt. There's just no words for it, how you feel when you get information like that. He did give us hope that she is alive. And then soon after that, we did get another phone call of another sighting of Pepita outside of a supermarket on Wantabo Boulevard. I was like, oh my God, I hope it's her. So I left work. I totally dropped doing what I was doing, went over there, and there was a young lady that was crossing the street away from the supermarket. It looked like her from a distance. That's where she was crossing, was right here. And I chased her. I saw her coming, and I was driving, and I turned around, but she walked a little bit faster. I parked at the roadway and I ran after her. And I said, Pepita. I was like, hey, stop, And she finally stopped, and she turned around, and oh my God, a spit image of her I was actually looking at her. It is a spit image of her face. However, she's taller, and she has no moles, and her hair was longer. I was like, oh my God, you look like my sister. She goes, I know, people's been telling me that. And she said people did approach her a couple of times already and told her, Pepita, your family's looking for you. Pepita, go home. And she told them, I'm not Pepita. As when I knew, I said, oh my God, I said, you're the one that people has been calling us about, that you are Pepita. I called my mom, I told her, I found that person that they were talking about. That girl is well aware of Pepita being missing. They think they mistake her of her. But Mom, it's not her. It's not her. And she broke down. It's frustrating when we did get these leads, stopping and going and rushing over there and not finding anything is discouraging, very discouraging. We kind of gave up a little bit.
Pepita has now been missing for about a year and a half with no coverage on local TV. And on September 11th, 2021, a major case of a missing person breaks. A young white woman named Gabby Petito was reported missing, and it makes national news. We couldn't go anywhere without catching an update on the case.
Gabriella's 5'5", 110 pounds. Her YouTube video.
I think our plan for today is to just hang out.
Showcases life on the road.
I remember watching Gabby Pepito's story on the news.
The FBI is involved in this search, as are police in New York, which just shows how wide-ranging and far-reaching this investigation is.
I was upset because she got a lot of immediate attention to get assistance to help finding her, plus the fact that she's white and she's on TikTok. That's what really upset me. How did it get so big in the media versus Pepita here, my sister? Why? You know, that was my question, was why? Why couldn't you guys help us when we asked?
What they saw in the Gabby Petito case was nice white woman goes missing. And the system, the mechanisms of media and law enforcement were moving quickly in a way that they had been trying to get going. So a little sense of outrage and how quickly it happened for somebody else who's different than them.
What caught my attention too is like the names. Gabby, her last name is almost similar as Pepita's. I thought that's a sign. We're not gonna give up. I'm gonna go back out there with my mom and say, hey, Pepita's story needs to be heard. On October 3rd, 2021, we did a rally to get assistance to help find my sister, Pepita Redhair.
Part of the things that I did were getting guest speakers, getting donations for food, doing press releases. I wanted to give other family members, other who had missing loved ones, the opportunity to also speak. And so we had just this tremendous turnout of families that had never been able to have a voice. We had balloons with everybody's names, and we took a moment of silence. It was very emotional for these families, but it also gave them hope that they were not alone.
We owe it to one another to do everything that we can to make sure that these women come home.
One of the really fabulous things that occurred is that District Attorney Raul Torres agreed to take this case.
We met with Pepita Redhair's family. They shared with us their frustration with the fact that the epidemic of violence against Native women, the alarming rate at which they disappear, largely gets ignored. In 2017, it was reported that there were 5,700 missing and murdered Indigenous women nationwide. Over a 5-year period, just in the state of New Mexico, there were over 660 reported missing and murdered Indigenous women. There is the idea that not everyone in this country is getting equal justice. We need to be in a position where we value all of these families. It doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from. We care about you, and we're going to go to every length that we can to recover your loved one. We've assigned 2 investigators to work on Pepita's case.
The district attorney's office, and I also believe the Albuquerque Police Department, was able to get warrants for electronic media. They were able to get warrants for telephones. They were able to look at truck stops and some other places Pepita frequented. They were able to talk with the FBI. They also were able to get DNA swabs that were used to try to help identify the DNA makeup of Pepita. They went to the morgue to see if anyone matched that description. And then they were able also to look at some of the evidence that was brought in by Pepita's family. They were able to take statements.
What I would like to see is a thorough search of Nick's home, and I would like a search to be done on the West Mesa area.
A year and a half is a very long gap for us in terms of the timeline that we usually like to engage in. We remain optimistic, but at this point, I don't have any clear answers about what happened to her.
I am extremely proud that Anita King is able to tell her story today, because this does not happen hardly in any murdered missing Indigenous women cases. But does it stop here? No. We're going to continue to find answers and find justice for Pepita.
I miss my daughter, Pepita. I miss her smile. She's always in my heart and my mind. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep talking to medias. I'm going to put her name out there, put her picture out there. If you heard something,
London has a way of swallowing people without making a sound. Millions of footsteps cross its streets every single day, disappearing beneath the rumble of buses, the echo of underground trains, and the endless drizzle that paints every pavement with a silver sheen. Faces drift past one another beneath umbrellas. Conversations dissolve into traffic. Lives begin, change, and sometimes end without anyone noticing until much later. In a city that never truly stops moving, it is frighteningly easy for someone to vanish. During the mid-1980s, that quiet truth became a nightmare for a small community already living beneath layers of fear. Young men walked into crowded bars searching for companionship, laughter, or perhaps simply a place where they could exist without judgment for a few precious hours. Some of them would never return home. There was no dramatic warning. No newspaper headline announcing that a predator had arrived. No police bulletin describing a face everyone should remember. Evil did not appear wearing a mask. It smiled. It listened. It bought drinks. It spoke with confidence and patience. It blended effortlessly into London's nightlife, becoming just another stranger leaning against a crowded bar while music drowned out the sound of caution. If you had seen him standing there, nothing would have demanded your attention. His clothes were neat. His appearance was carefully maintained. His voice carried the calm assurance of someone comfortable in conversation. He did not look desperate. He did not appear unstable. He understood the subtle language of trust. He knew when to laugh, when to remain silent, and when to make another person feel as though they had been noticed after spending an entire evening being invisible. That was perhaps his greatest weapon. Not strength. Not rage. Trust. Long before investigators would connect a series of murders to one man, there were only isolated tragedies scattered across the city. A body discovered in a flat. Another man who simply stopped answering the telephone. Someone who failed to arrive at work. Friends who assumed he had gone away for a few days. Families waiting for letters that never came. Each disappearance seemed like a separate story, another unfortunate event inside one of Europe's largest cities. Few people imagined they were watching the opening chapters of a single horrifying pattern. The streets themselves offered no answers. Rain arrived almost daily, washing away footprints before sunrise. The cold carried people indoors, leaving witnesses with fragmented memories. Neon lights reflected across wet asphalt, turning every alley into a mirror of shifting colors where faces blurred together. The city became both the perfect hunting ground and the perfect hiding place. At night, Soho transformed into another world entirely. The daylight crowds gave way to music spilling through open doorways, cigarette smoke drifting above conversations, and strangers searching for brief moments of connection. For many gay men living in Britain during the 1980s, these streets represented far more than entertainment. They were places of belonging during an era when acceptance remained painfully limited. Inside these clubs and pubs, people could laugh a little louder, speak a little more honestly, and forget, if only for a few hours, that outside those doors judgment often waited. Yet even here, fear lingered in quiet corners. The decade itself carried a heavy burden. News reports spoke relentlessly about a mysterious illness spreading through communities. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Anxiety settled over countless lives. Many people already felt isolated before a murderer ever entered the picture. Trust became complicated. Loneliness became common. Against that backdrop, a friendly stranger seemed less like a danger and more like an opportunity to escape another lonely evening. No one ever believes they are walking toward the worst night of their life. The men who crossed paths with the future killer were not reckless thrill seekers. They were ordinary people. Some had steady jobs. Some had dreams of building careers. Others had recently ended relationships or hoped to begin new ones. They carried shopping bags, joked with friends, complained about work, worried about rent, and planned holidays they expected to take months later. They were living lives so ordinary that history rarely remembers them the way it should. Crime often grants the killer an infamous legacy while reducing victims to names listed beneath newspaper headlines. But before they became victims, they were sons, brothers, colleagues, neighbors, and friends. They laughed at bad jokes. They made promises. They had favorite songs. They expected tomorrow to arrive. Somewhere else in London, another evening unfolded with remarkable normality. Traffic lights changed from red to green. A couple argued over dinner before making peace. A taxi driver complained about the weather. Bartenders polished glasses while waiting for the next rush of customers. Office workers loosened their ties after another exhausting day. A newspaper vendor folded unsold copies beneath his arm. Nothing suggested that, hidden among thousands of ordinary routines, someone was preparing to destroy another human life. Predators rarely hunt with theatrical cruelty. Reality is quieter than fiction. Violence often begins with something almost forgettable, a smile across a crowded room, an offer to continue a conversation somewhere quieter, the comforting illusion that another lonely person understands exactly how you feel. That illusion would become fatal. By the time investigators finally understood what they were facing, several families had already received devastating news. Several lives had already ended in silence. Several crime scenes had already been cleaned, photographed, catalogued, and filed away, each one appearing to belong to a different story. It would take persistence, coincidence, and the courage of someone who survived to reveal that the same shadow had been moving through London's night long before anyone recognized its shape. The man responsible was named Michele Del Marco Lupo, though many came to know him as Michael Lupo after his move from Italy to Britain. On paper, his story appeared almost ordinary. Born in Bologna in 1953, he later settled in London and worked in the fashion industry, managing an upscale clothing store. Customers saw professionalism. Colleagues saw discipline. Casual acquaintances saw another immigrant building a life in one of Europe's busiest cities. Very few people suspected that beneath that carefully controlled exterior existed impulses no one around him could fully comprehend. Years later, investigators would attempt to explain what drove him. Some theories pointed toward illness. Others suggested resentment, rejection, or psychological instability. None of them fully answered the question that continues to haunt true crime researchers today. Why did these murders happen? Why these victims? Why did an apparently ordinary man become someone capable of such calculated brutality? Those questions remain surrounded by uncertainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most unsettling part of all. Not every monster leaves behind a motive that satisfies the human need for explanation. Sometimes the evidence tells us what happened without ever revealing why. This is the story of a city that overlooked a pattern until it was almost too late, of lives interrupted without warning, of an investigation that slowly assembled scattered fragments into a terrifying picture. And of a killer who understood that the easiest way to hide was never to appear frightening in the first place. Before justice finally arrived, London would learn a painful lesson that still echoes decades later. Sometimes the most dangerous face in the room is the one no one remembers seeing. The first death did not announce the beginning of a serial murder case. It arrived quietly, almost anonymously, folded into the endless rhythm of a city accustomed to tragedy. Detectives examined a crime scene, collected photographs, measured distances, recorded observations, and carried out the routine every homicide investigation demanded. There were questions, of course, but not the kind that suggested a predator was moving freely through London's streets. At least, not yet. Every investigation begins with the hope that the answers are nearby. A witness who noticed something unusual. A fingerprint left on a glass. A forgotten receipt in a jacket pocket. A neighbor awakened by an unfamiliar voice. Investigators believe, at least in those first precious hours, that the truth is waiting somewhere inside the room. But there are cases where the room keeps its secrets, where silence proves stronger than evidence, and where time slowly becomes the killer's greatest accomplice. That silence settled over each crime scene connected to Michael Lupo. Nothing about the murders resembled a public spectacle. There were no dramatic chases through crowded streets. No desperate screams echoing across neighborhoods. The violence unfolded behind closed doors, inside private spaces where strangers believed they had found safety rather than danger. Walls absorbed sounds that no one outside would ever hear. Curtains remained drawn. By the following morning, London resumed its ordinary routine, completely unaware that another life had ended during the night. Perhaps that is what makes these crimes feel so disturbingly modern even decades later. The victims did not disappear into forests or abandoned buildings far from civilization. They vanished within one of the busiest cities on Earth, surrounded by millions of people living only a few streets away. Distance was never the killer's greatest protection. Indifference was. To understand why these murders remained disconnected for so long, it is necessary to understand London itself during the mid-1980s. It was a city of extraordinary contrasts. Wealth stood beside poverty. Historic architecture overlooked neglected neighborhoods. Financial ambition shared the same streets as loneliness. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people arrived, and hundreds of thousands left. Some stayed for a lifetime. Others disappeared after only a weekend. People came seeking careers, freedom, adventure, or simply anonymity. For many gay men, anonymity carried a complicated meaning. Although significant social progress had begun, prejudice remained deeply rooted. Many people still hid important parts of their identity from colleagues, relatives, and even close friends. Nights spent in Soho or other gathering places often represented an escape from daily caution. There, names could be shared without hesitation. Hands could be held without constantly checking who might be watching. Laughter felt genuine because it did not require pretending to be someone else. But hidden communities often create hidden vulnerabilities. A missing person might not immediately be reported if family relationships were strained. Friends sometimes assumed someone had left town unexpectedly. Employers believed an employee had resigned without notice. Partners occasionally knew very little about each other's relatives or personal histories. These circumstances were not unique to the LGBTQ+ community, but social stigma could make disappearances harder to notice quickly and investigations more complicated. Those realities shaped the environment in which the killer operated, though they never diminished the value of the lives that were lost. The murderer did not invent these vulnerabilities. He exploited them. Imagine an ordinary evening unfolding exactly as thousands had before. Music pours through an open doorway. Glasses clink against polished wooden counters. Someone laughs loudly enough to turn a few heads before disappearing into the crowd again. Cigarette smoke drifts lazily toward the ceiling while conversations overlap into an indistinct hum. Strangers become acquaintances over shared drinks. Acquaintances exchange addresses. Someone suggests continuing the evening somewhere quieter. There is nothing remarkable about that sequence of events. In fact, millions of friendships and relationships begin exactly this way. That ordinary beginning is precisely what transformed these crimes into something so deeply unsettling. No flashing warning light ever appeared above the killer's head. No instinctive feeling of danger forced people to leave the conversation. Those who encountered him often met a man who seemed composed, articulate, and capable of making others feel comfortable. He understood personal space. He knew how to maintain eye contact without appearing aggressive. He listened carefully enough to encourage trust while revealing very little about himself. The most effective disguise is often normality. History repeatedly demonstrates that serial offenders rarely resemble fictional villains. Many understand social expectations extraordinarily well. They know when to smile, when to apologize, when to appear vulnerable, and when to project confidence. Some build successful careers. Others maintain friendships. Their public identity becomes another carefully managed performance, allowing horrific private behavior to remain concealed behind an ordinary face. Michael Lupo appeared to understand that performance. By day, he existed within respectable surroundings connected to the fashion industry, a profession associated with presentation, detail, and refinement. Customers judged clothing, fabrics, and appearance. Presentation mattered. First impressions mattered. Confidence mattered. Whether intentionally or instinctively, he seemed to carry those same qualities into his personal interactions, making it easier for others to lower their guard. Meanwhile, investigators searching for answers found themselves facing an entirely different problem. Each murder generated evidence, but evidence does not automatically create understanding. Detectives can recover fingerprints without knowing whose fingerprints they are. They can document injuries without identifying who caused them. They can reconstruct the final hours of a victim's life while still failing to discover the individual who shared those final moments. The difference between information and understanding often determines whether a case is solved quickly or remains unsolved for years. At first, there was simply not enough understanding. London's police were dealing with countless investigations simultaneously. Robberies, assaults, domestic violence, organized crime, missing persons, and homicides competed for limited resources. Detectives worked long hours pursuing leads that frequently ended in disappointment. Every decision required balancing urgency against probability. Which witness deserved another interview? Which laboratory result might change the investigation? Which case demanded immediate attention? Somewhere within that overwhelming workload, a pattern remained invisible. Not because investigators lacked determination. Not because victims mattered less. Because patterns are often easiest to recognize only after enough pieces have accumulated to form a recognizable picture. The tragedy is that every additional piece represented another human being. Someone whose chair at dinner would remain empty. Someone whose telephone would never ring again. Someone whose family would begin measuring time by the moment everything changed. Long before newspapers attached the phrase serial killer to Michael Lupo's name, grief had already entered multiple homes. Parents struggled to understand unbearable news. Friends replayed their final conversations, searching desperately for overlooked clues hidden inside ordinary memories. Did he seem nervous? Had he mentioned meeting someone? Was there anything unusual about that last goodbye? Memory becomes cruel after tragedy. Moments once considered insignificant suddenly feel priceless. Every sentence spoken during the final conversation is examined again and again. Every smile acquires unbearable weight because it unknowingly became the last one. Those left behind rarely receive satisfying answers. Even after an arrest, even after convictions, there are questions no courtroom can resolve. What exactly happened during those final minutes? Did they realize they were in danger? Did they believe someone would come to help? The evidence can establish timelines. It can explain injuries. It can identify the person responsible. But it cannot fully reconstruct fear, hope, or the final thoughts inside another human mind. That uncertainty remains one of the deepest wounds every homicide leaves behind. As London's nights continued, the killer remained free. He walked familiar streets beneath the same streetlights as everyone else. He entered shops. He exchanged casual greetings. He blended effortlessly into crowds rushing between underground stations and late-night cafes. To strangers, he looked no different from thousands of other men trying to build ordinary lives in an extraordinary city. Yet somewhere beneath that carefully maintained exterior, another search had already begun. He was looking for his next conversation. His next drink. His next victim. There is a dangerous assumption that people often make after hearing stories like this. We imagine that evil is loud. We expect it to leave obvious warning signs, to reveal itself through uncontrollable anger, strange behavior, or an appearance that immediately unsettles everyone in the room. It is a comforting belief because it allows us to think that we would have recognized the danger. We tell ourselves we would have walked away, trusted our instincts, refused the invitation, chosen a different street, a different conversation, a different ending. Reality offers no such comfort. The men who met Michael Lupo were not making irrational decisions. They were doing what countless people still do every single day. They spoke to someone who appeared friendly. They accepted kindness at face value. They believed that an ordinary evening could remain ordinary. There was nothing remarkable about wanting company after work, about sharing a drink with someone new, or about hoping that a brief encounter might become the beginning of a friendship or something more meaningful. Those choices were never the mistake. The responsibility for what followed belongs entirely to the man who exploited that trust. As investigators would later piece together the fragments of this case, one realization became increasingly difficult to ignore. The murders were not driven by sudden explosions of emotion. They appeared calculated. The killer selected environments where introductions happened naturally. He relied on privacy rather than force in public. He understood that once a door closed behind two people, the outside world disappeared. Whatever happened next would leave very few witnesses. That realization transformed the investigation from a series of isolated homicides into something far more disturbing. Detectives were no longer searching for someone who had lost control during a single confrontation. They were looking for a man who seemed capable of returning to ordinary life after extraordinary violence, someone who could wake the next morning, dress carefully, go to work, exchange polite conversation, and carry on as though nothing had happened. Perhaps that is one of the most unsettling truths hidden inside many true crime stories. Monsters rarely think of themselves as monsters. They shop for groceries. They wait in line for coffee. They complain about the weather. They exist beside ordinary people without drawing attention. The distance between normality and horror is often far smaller than anyone wishes to believe. Years later, when the headlines had faded and courtrooms had emptied, people would continue asking the same question. How could someone live two lives so completely? How could colleagues, acquaintances, and casual friends fail to see what was hidden beneath the surface? The answer is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. Because human beings cannot read one another's minds. Every day we trust complete strangers. We board buses driven by people we have never met. We sit beside unfamiliar passengers on trains. We shake hands with new colleagues, accept recommendations from shop assistants, and ask strangers for directions. Society functions because trust is our default setting. Without it, ordinary life would become impossible. That same trust, however, can also become a weapon in the hands of someone determined to abuse it. The story of Michael Lupo is not simply the story of one killer. It is also the story of a city learning, one painful revelation at a time, how easily violence can hide behind familiarity. It is the story of detectives forced to challenge their earliest assumptions, of families waiting for answers that seemed forever out of reach, and of survivors whose courage would eventually illuminate what so many others never had the chance to describe. It is equally a story about the victims themselves, men whose names deserve to be remembered for far more than the way their lives ended. Before they became evidence files, before photographs were pinned to investigation boards, before newspaper reports reduced their existence to a few paragraphs, they were individuals with routines, ambitions, friendships, and futures that stretched far beyond a single night in London. Their stories did not begin with tragedy, and they should never be defined only by it. As we move deeper into this case, it is important to separate verified fact from speculation. Over the years, theories emerged about Lupo's motives, including suggestions connected to illness, resentment, and personal grievances. Some attracted significant public attention, while others were repeated often enough to sound like established truth. Yet many of those explanations were never conclusively proven. The surviving evidence tells us with confidence who committed these crimes and how the investigation ultimately identified him. It does not fully explain why he chose this path. That uncertainty remains part of the historical record, and it deserves to remain acknowledged rather than replaced by convenient assumptions. There is a temptation in every true crime story to search for a single moment that explains everything. One traumatic childhood event. One devastating rejection. One psychological break. Reality is rarely that simple. Human behavior, particularly violent behavior, is shaped by countless influences, many of which remain invisible even after years of investigation. Sometimes the evidence answers every legal question while leaving the deepest human questions unresolved. That is exactly where this story begins. Not with certainty. Not with perfect explanations. But with unanswered questions scattered across a city that had not yet realized they all belonged to the same nightmare. Over the next chapters, we will step back into London during the mid-1980s, exploring the world in which these events unfolded. We will meet the people whose lives intersected with a man they believed to be ordinary. We will follow investigators as isolated clues slowly evolved into a coherent pattern. We will witness the breakthrough that finally exposed the killer's carefully maintained facade and brought an end to a cycle of violence that had remained hidden for far too long. Justice would eventually arrive, but it came only after irreversible loss. Courtroom verdicts can establish guilt. Prison sentences can remove dangerous offenders from society. Neither can restore birthdays that were never celebrated, conversations that never happened, or futures that disappeared in silence. For the families, the friends, and the community left behind, the conclusion of the investigation was not the end of the story. It was simply the moment when grief finally had a name. And for everyone else, it became a lasting reminder that the greatest danger is not always found in dark alleyways or abandoned streets. Sometimes it is waiting beneath the warm lights of a crowded room, smiling politely, speaking softly, and patiently earning the one thing every predator needs before anything else. Trust. In 1985, London was a city caught between two identities. By day, it projected confidence to the world. Tower cranes stretched above the skyline, new businesses emerged alongside centuries-old institutions, and the rhythm of commerce echoed through crowded financial districts. Double-decker buses rolled past Victorian buildings blackened by decades of rain and pollution, while commuters hurried through underground stations with newspapers tucked beneath their arms. The city seemed unstoppable, driven by ambition, opportunity, and the constant movement of millions of people whose lives intersected only for brief moments before drifting apart again. But beneath that confident surface, London carried invisible fractures. Every great city has places where people feel anonymous, where loneliness exists even in the middle of enormous crowds. London was no exception. A person could spend an entire day surrounded by thousands of strangers without exchanging more than a handful of words. Faces blurred together. Neighbors often remained strangers. Entire lives unfolded behind apartment doors that were never opened to the people living only a few feet away. For many, that anonymity represented freedom. For others, it became isolation. The city changed dramatically after sunset. As office lights gradually disappeared one floor at a time, another London slowly awakened. Neon signs flickered to life above pubs and clubs. Music escaped through half-open doors onto rain-soaked streets. Taxi headlights reflected across wet pavement like ribbons of gold stretching into the darkness. Restaurants filled with conversations that blended into a constant murmur, while bartenders prepared for another long night serving customers searching for celebration, companionship, or simply an escape from another ordinary day. Among the neighborhoods that transformed most completely after dark was Soho. Its narrow streets pulsed with energy unlike anywhere else in the city. Cafes remained busy long after midnight. Theaters emptied into crowds looking for somewhere to continue the evening. Musicians carried instrument cases between performances. Artists debated ideas over cheap drinks. Tourists wandered without maps, drawn toward the colorful lights that promised excitement around every corner. For London's gay community, Soho offered something even more valuable than entertainment. It offered visibility. During a period when prejudice remained deeply woven into everyday life, these streets became places where many people could briefly set aside the careful performance they maintained elsewhere. Inside certain pubs and clubs, conversations became more honest. Smiles came more naturally. People introduced themselves without first calculating whether honesty might cost them their job, their housing, or their relationship with family members. That freedom was precious because it had not come easily. Although homosexuality had been partially decriminalized in England years earlier, legal change had not erased social attitudes overnight. Many people still concealed their identity from co-workers. Some avoided discussing their personal lives entirely. Others traveled across the city rather than risk being recognized near places associated with the LGBTQ+ community. Even those fortunate enough to live openly often understood that acceptance could disappear the moment they stepped into a different neighborhood or workplace. Against that backdrop, community mattered. Friendships formed quickly because shared experiences created immediate understanding. Regular customers greeted familiar bartenders by name. Faces became recognizable after enough evenings spent in the same places. A newcomer could arrive alone yet leave feeling less isolated than when the night began. It was within this environment that countless ordinary stories unfolded. People celebrated promotions. They mourned failed relationships. They danced after difficult weeks. They laughed at terrible jokes. They complained about impossible landlords. They planned holidays they hoped to afford. Life continued with all the ordinary hopes and disappointments that define every community. The victims who would later become connected to Michael Lupo were part of that world. Before newspaper articles reduced them to brief descriptions, they were individuals building lives inside one of Europe's busiest cities. Some had relocated to London seeking opportunity. Others had grown up nearby and watched the city evolve around them. Each carried personal ambitions that extended far beyond the final chapter of their lives. The tragedy of many homicide investigations is that the victim's identity gradually becomes replaced by the crime itself. A person's profession disappears behind forensic reports. Their sense of humor fades beneath courtroom testimony. Their dreams become overshadowed by discussions of evidence. Yet every photograph collected during an investigation captures someone who expected tomorrow to arrive. Someone who believed there would be another morning. Meanwhile, London itself faced another growing crisis that shaped daily life in ways difficult to fully appreciate today. The AIDS epidemic spread fear across entire communities. Medical knowledge remained incomplete. Rumors often traveled faster than reliable information. Newspapers published alarming headlines. Television reports frequently mixed scientific uncertainty with public anxiety. Many people found themselves confronting both the physical threat of illness and the emotional burden of stigma. Within the gay community, that fear carried particular weight. Friends attended more funerals than anyone should experience in a lifetime. Conversations that once centered on careers or relationships increasingly included discussions about hospitals, symptoms, and uncertainty. Every unexpected illness created fresh anxiety. Every headline seemed to suggest another reason to be afraid. At the same time, discrimination intensified. Some people wrongly treated the epidemic as justification for prejudice that had existed long before the disease itself. Misinformation spread rapidly, fueling suspicion instead of compassion. For many LGBTQ+ individuals, daily life became an exhausting balance between resilience and vulnerability. This wider social atmosphere is important because it formed the emotional landscape surrounding the murders. It did not cause the crimes. It did not excuse the killer. But it influenced how people lived, whom they trusted, and how communities responded to danger. Imagine walking through Soho on a cool evening during those years. Rain has just stopped. The air carries the smell of wet pavement mixed with cigarette smoke and fresh coffee drifting from nearby cafes. Music escapes from open doorways in competing rhythms. Groups of friends move between venues, laughing loudly enough to overpower the traffic. Couples stroll beneath shared umbrellas. A newspaper blows across the street before becoming trapped against a parked car. Nothing about the scene suggests violence. Nothing hints that somewhere among the crowd walks a man whose name will eventually become associated with one of London's lesser-known serial murder cases. That contrast is what makes this story so unsettling. Life and death occupied the same streets at the same time. Hope and danger stood only a few steps apart. People searching for connection unknowingly crossed paths with someone searching for victims. Yet if you had asked anyone there to identify the most dangerous person in the neighborhood, almost no one would have pointed toward Michael Lupo. He did not appear threatening. He did not carry himself like a man consumed by violence. He looked exactly like someone who belonged there. And in a city where belonging often meant everything, that ordinary appearance became the perfect disguise. Beyond the glow of Soho, London stretched outward like a patchwork of entirely different worlds stitched together by railway lines, crowded roads, and the underground. Wealthy districts with elegant Georgian townhouses existed only a few miles from neighborhoods where aging apartment blocks stood weathered by decades of neglect. Every borough had its own rhythm, its own unwritten rules, its own stories that rarely reached the front pages. It was a city too vast for anyone to truly know in its entirety. For newcomers, London could feel both exhilarating and overwhelming. It promised opportunity with one hand and anonymity with the other. Thousands of people arrived every year carrying little more than a suitcase, a few savings, and the hope that the city would become the place where life finally began. Some came from small English towns looking for careers unavailable back home. Others crossed international borders, believing London offered a future impossible elsewhere. Languages from across Europe echoed through markets, cafes, and train stations. Different cultures blended together, creating a city that constantly reinvented itself. Among those newcomers, years earlier, had been a young Italian man named Michele del Marco Lupo. Born in Bologna on January 19, 1953, he grew up far from the streets that would later become central to one of Britain's most disturbing criminal investigations. Like many immigrants of his generation, moving to London represented more than a change of address. It meant beginning again. A different language, different customs, different expectations. Success would depend not only on hard work but also on the ability to adapt. By the mid-1980s, adaptation appeared to be one of his strengths. He had established himself in the city's fashion industry, eventually managing an upscale clothing store. It was the kind of position that demanded attention to detail, professionalism, and confidence when dealing with customers. Presentation mattered. Appearance mattered. A well-tailored jacket, polished shoes, and calm conversation could shape first impressions before a single garment was sold. To colleagues and customers, he seemed capable of performing that role. Nothing about his professional life suggested the existence of the violence investigators would later uncover. This contrast continues to disturb criminologists and investigators alike. Society often searches for obvious indicators, believing extraordinary crimes must be committed by obviously extraordinary people. Yet many violent offenders maintain ordinary routines that conceal their private lives with unsettling effectiveness. Employment, social interaction, and outward stability do not automatically reveal what exists behind closed doors. For Michael Lupo, normality became camouflage. While he was building a respectable public image, London's nightlife continued drawing people from every corner of the city. Friday evenings brought office workers eager to forget another demanding week. Saturdays attracted tourists, students, artists, musicians, and countless others seeking excitement. Every crowded venue created new opportunities for chance encounters. Most of those encounters led nowhere. A brief conversation over drinks. An exchange of telephone numbers that was never followed up. A promise to meet again that quietly faded with time. That was the ordinary rhythm of city life. But occasionally, one seemingly harmless conversation altered everything. Looking back decades later, it is tempting to imagine that every victim sensed something unusual before accepting Lupo's company. There is no evidence to support that belief. In fact, the available record suggests the opposite. The interactions that preceded the attacks appear to have begun in ways so commonplace that they attracted little attention from anyone nearby. That ordinary beginning is precisely why these crimes proved so difficult to recognize as connected. Nothing separated one conversation from hundreds of others unfolding around it. A smile. A greeting. An introduction. Perhaps a shared drink. Perhaps a casual walk through streets already beginning to empty as midnight approached. Scenes repeated thousands of times every weekend. In retrospect, they seem filled with invisible danger. At the time, They looked completely ordinary. This difference between hindsight and reality is one of the greatest challenges in understanding historical criminal investigations. Once the outcome becomes known, every earlier decision appears significant. Every coincidence feels meaningful. Every overlooked detail seems obvious. Yet investigators working in real time possess none of that certainty. They face incomplete evidence, conflicting witness statements, unreliable memories, and countless possibilities that ultimately lead nowhere. The same was true in London. Detectives investigating violent crime during the 1980s relied on techniques far less advanced than those available today. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. Surveillance cameras were far less common. Mobile phones did not record locations or preserve digital conversations. There were no social media accounts to reconstruct movements, no instant messages to establish timelines, no smartphones quietly documenting every hour of a person's day. An evening could disappear almost completely once the last eyewitness walked away. Investigators depended heavily upon interviews, physical evidence, handwritten records, and patient detective work. That meant time mattered enormously. The longer it took to identify connections, the colder every trail became. Witnesses forgot faces. Memories changed. Potential evidence disappeared. Routine cleaning erased traces that might once have answered important questions. Against that backdrop, a careful offender enjoyed advantages that would become increasingly difficult to overcome. Yet London itself continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Morning commuters still packed train platforms shoulder to shoulder. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors before sunrise. Street vendors arranged newspapers into neat stacks while headlines focused on politics, economics, sports, and the continuing uncertainty surrounding the AIDS crisis. Children hurried toward school carrying oversized backpacks. Office workers filled cafes before disappearing into another day of meetings and deadlines. Life possesses an extraordinary ability to continue alongside tragedy. Somewhere, a family receives devastating news while another celebrates the birth of a child. One street hosts a wedding. Another hosts a funeral. Cities contain countless emotional worlds existing simultaneously, rarely aware of one another. That was London in 1985. A place overflowing with ambition, creativity, resilience, and diversity. A city where people fell in love every day. A city where friendships began over coffee, careers flourished, and dreams slowly took shape. It was also a city where a predator discovered that the same openness which made meaningful human connection possible could also be manipulated. The killer did not create London's loneliness. He recognized it. He understood that beneath the confidence many people projected existed the universal desire to be seen, understood, and accepted. A kind conversation could open doors that force never could. Patience often accomplished what intimidation failed to achieve. Those truths are not unique to this case. They appear repeatedly throughout criminal history because they reflect something fundamentally human. Trust is rarely given all at once. It is earned through small moments, a smile returned, a joke shared, a gesture that appears thoughtful rather than calculated. By the time suspicion finally arrives, it is sometimes already too late. As autumn gave way to colder months and another London winter approached, the city remained unaware that several seemingly unrelated tragedies were beginning to trace the outline of something much larger. The pattern was still incomplete. The connections remained hidden. Neither investigators nor the public yet realized they were witnessing the early chapters of a serial murder investigation that would eventually expose one of the capital's least remembered, yet deeply disturbing, killers. The storm had already begun. Almost no one could see it forming. History has a peculiar habit of reducing entire years to a handful of headlines. Ask someone to remember Britain in the mid-1980s, and they might recall political debates, economic change, or the growing fear surrounding the AIDS epidemic. Ask them about London's nightlife, and they may picture bright neon lights, packed clubs, fashionable boutiques, and streets alive long after midnight. Rarely do those memories include the quiet stories unfolding between the headlines, the ordinary evenings that never made the news because they were expected to end like every other evening. Those forgotten moments are where this story truly begins. Not inside a police station. Not in a courtroom. Not at a crime scene. But in the countless ordinary decisions made by ordinary people. Someone leaves work later than expected and decides to stop for a drink before heading home. Another accepts an invitation from friends instead of spending the evening alone. A bartender greets familiar faces while wiping down the counter. A taxi pulls away from the curb carrying passengers whose paths will never cross again. A shop closes its doors for the night as the manager switches off the lights, unaware that somewhere else in the city another life is quietly moving toward tragedy. None of these moments appear remarkable on their own. Together, they form the living backdrop against which every criminal investigation unfolds. It is tempting to imagine history as a sequence of dramatic turning points, yet reality is far less theatrical. Most lives change during moments that feel completely ordinary at the time. A conversation lasts a few minutes longer than expected. A different route is taken home because of the weather. A stranger smiles. An invitation is accepted. Only afterward do those moments acquire unbearable significance. For investigators looking back on the Michael Lupo case, the challenge was not understanding what happened after the violence began. It was reconstructing everything that happened before it. Every victim had lived a full life before becoming part of a homicide investigation. Each had routines, friendships, favorite places, and plans extending far beyond the night their story was interrupted. Understanding those routines would become essential because somewhere within them lay the invisible point where an ordinary evening became a fatal encounter. Yet another important reality shaped this investigation from the very beginning. Despite the seriousness of the crimes, Michael Lupo never became a household name in the way some serial killers did. His case received attention, particularly after his arrest and guilty pleas, but over time it faded from broader public memory. Decades later, many people interested in true crime have never heard his name at all. That obscurity should not be mistaken for insignificance. The impact of a crime is measured not by the size of its headlines but by the lives forever altered because it happened. For the families of the victims, publicity changed nothing. An empty chair remained empty. A birthday still arrived each year without the person they expected to celebrate it. Photographs continued to capture smiles that could never be seen again except through memory. Justice, when it finally came, answered legal questions. It could never erase personal loss. That is why this story deserves to be told with care. Not to glorify the man who committed these crimes. Not to transform violence into entertainment. But to understand how a seemingly ordinary individual was able to conceal extraordinary brutality, how investigators slowly uncovered the truth, and how the victims' lives became intertwined with a case that still raises difficult questions decades later. As we continue, the focus will move away from the streets themselves and toward the people who walked them. We will begin to know the men whose lives were cut short, not merely as names recorded in court documents, but as individuals with histories, relationships, ambitions, and futures they expected to reach. Their humanity deserves far more attention than the notoriety of the man who took it from them. Because before there was a killer being hunted by detectives, there were people living ordinary lives. Before there was a courtroom, there were families waiting for loved ones to come home. Before there was a conviction, there were unanswered questions hanging over a city that had not yet realized a predator was moving through its nightlife. And before Michael Lupo became known for the crimes that defined his legacy, he was simply another face in London's crowd, a face that almost no one had any reason to fear. That ordinary appearance would become his greatest advantage. It would also become the investigator's greatest challenge. The story of those who encountered him is only just beginning. The next chapter belongs not to the killer, but to the victims whose lives gave this case its lasting human weight. Every murder investigation begins with a name. Not the name of the killer. The name of someone who was loved. That simple truth is often forgotten as time transforms criminal cases into documentaries, podcasts, books, and newspaper archives. The person responsible becomes the subject of endless analysis, while those whose lives were stolen slowly fade into the background, remembered only through crime scene photographs or brief descriptions inside court records. It is an imbalance that exists in almost every famous case. The louder the killer's reputation becomes, the quieter the victim's voices seem to grow. This story deserves a different beginning. Before they became part of a homicide investigation, the men targeted by Michael Lupo were living ordinary lives inside an extraordinary city. They woke to alarm clocks, rushed to work through London's crowded streets, met friends after long days, paid bills, worried about the future, laughed at small jokes, and imagined years that still seemed comfortably distant. Their lives were not defined by violence. Violence interrupted them. The historical record preserves only fragments of who they were. Court documents record names, dates, occupations, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. Newspapers of the time focused largely on the investigation rather than the people whose absence created it. Decades later, many personal details have been lost. Their favorite songs, the stories they told at dinner, the dreams they carried into adulthood, and the countless ordinary moments that made them unique rarely survived inside official records. That absence should not encourage imagination presented as fact. Instead, it reminds us of something deeply human. Every victim leaves behind far more than any investigation can ever document. Somewhere there was a family photograph tucked into a drawer. Somewhere there were birthday cards kept for sentimental reasons. Somewhere a friend still remembered a conversation that made them laugh until they could barely breathe. Somewhere an empty place at a dinner table remained painfully noticeable long after everyone stopped expecting it to be filled again. Those are the parts of a person's life that never appear inside evidence folders. Yet they are often the most important. The men who crossed paths with Michael Lupo shared one obvious characteristic in the eyes of the investigation. They were gay men living in or around London during the mid-1980s. Beyond that common thread, however, they were individuals whose lives cannot be reduced to a single label. Each carried his own experiences, relationships, ambitions, fears, and reasons for building a life in one of Europe's largest cities. For many members of London's LGBTQ+ community, daily life required balancing hope with caution. Some had come to the capital because smaller towns offered little acceptance. Others had lived in London for years, gradually building circles of trusted friends who became chosen families when biological relatives could not provide understanding or support. Many learned to recognize certain neighborhoods as places where they could finally relax, places where conversations no longer required careful editing, where introductions did not begin with uncertainty about whether honesty would be safe. Those spaces mattered. Not because they were perfect, but because they offered something increasingly valuable: belonging. It is impossible to appreciate this case without understanding that sense of belonging. Community was not merely social. It was emotional survival for many people navigating a society that still contained significant prejudice. A familiar bartender remembering your usual drink, a friend waving from across a crowded room, a conversation with someone who understood experiences that could not always be shared elsewhere. These ordinary moments created a feeling of safety that many people struggled to find beyond those streets. The tragedy is that predators often recognize safe spaces for very different reasons. Where others see community, they see opportunity. Where others see trust, they see access. Where others see friendship beginning, they see vulnerability. That painful reality would become increasingly clear as detectives reconstructed the movements of the victims. Most evenings began without anything unusual. Work ended. Plans changed. Someone suggested meeting for a drink. Another decided not to spend the night alone. London's nightlife welcomed them exactly as it welcomed thousands of others every week. No one leaves home expecting to become part of history. No one says goodbye believing it may be the final farewell. That is perhaps the cruelest aspect of homicide. Life does not pause beforehand. There is no warning that allows unfinished conversations to be completed or postponed dreams to become reality. Everything ordinary continues until, suddenly, it does not. Imagine one of those evenings. The underground doors slide open, releasing another wave of commuters onto the platform. Jackets remain damp from a passing shower. People climb escalators without looking at one another, each carrying private concerns invisible to everyone else. Outside, buses hiss to a stop before disappearing again into traffic. Shop windows reflect passing headlights. Somewhere, music has already begun inside a crowded pub. Among those moving through the city are men who expect nothing more dramatic than good conversation before returning home. One checks his reflection in a shop window. Another laughs quietly after remembering something a colleague said before work ended. Someone pauses beneath an awning, waiting for rain to ease before crossing the street. Each action is so ordinary that it would be forgotten by morning. Yet history remembers these evenings for an entirely different reason. Not because the victims behaved carelessly. Not because they ignored obvious danger. But because they encountered someone who deliberately exploited the ordinary kindness that allows strangers to become acquaintances. Years later, investigators and criminologists would study Michael Lupo's behavior, searching for patterns that explained how he approached his victims. The available evidence suggests he relied on conversation rather than confrontation, patience rather than urgency. He did not need crowded streets to become silent. He simply needed another person to believe that he posed no threat. Trust, once earned, accomplished everything else. That is why it is so important to remember the victims as people first. They were not defined by the decisions they made during one evening. They were defined by the lives they had built before that evening ever began. Some had careers they hoped would continue growing. Some had friendships strengthened over years. Some undoubtedly imagined futures that included love, stability, travel, and countless ordinary tomorrows. Those futures deserved to remain part of their story, even though they were never allowed to become reality. As detectives slowly assembled the timeline of the murders, they came to understand that every victim had unknowingly carried a small piece of the larger puzzle. No single life revealed the complete pattern. Only when the stories were viewed together did investigators begin to recognize the horrifying consistency hidden beneath what had once appeared to be isolated tragedies. By then, however, several lives had already been lost. Several families had already entered the long, painful journey that follows every unexplained death. And somewhere in London, the man responsible still moved through the city with the confidence of someone who believed he had become invisible. The impact of violent crime is rarely confined to the people whose names appear in court records. Every victim leaves behind a network of family members, friends, colleagues, and neighbors whose lives are permanently altered by the loss. A homicide investigation may eventually establish who committed the crime and how it happened, but it cannot restore the ordinary routines that disappeared along with the person who was taken. For the families connected to this case, uncertainty came before answers. A missed phone call did not immediately suggest tragedy. A cancelled plan could easily be explained by work, illness, or an unexpected change in schedule. In a city as large as London, people occasionally lost contact for days without anyone assuming the worst. It was only as hours became days, and days became longer periods of silence, that concern began to replace reassurance. Friends often became the first to notice that something was wrong. Someone failed to arrive for work without explanation. Someone did not appear at a regular social gathering. Telephone calls went unanswered. Small routines that had once seemed insignificant suddenly became meaningful because they had been broken. These moments are familiar to investigators. Missing person cases frequently begin with ordinary concerns rather than dramatic discoveries. Detectives must distinguish between people who have chosen to leave temporarily and those who may be in genuine danger. That process requires patience, careful documentation, and cooperation from the people who knew the missing individual best. In the Michael Lupo investigation, each victim's background helped investigators reconstruct the final days before the crime. Employment records, conversations with friends, recent movements, and known meeting places all became important pieces of a timeline. Although every victim had a different personal history, detectives gradually recognized similarities that would later prove significant. Those similarities did not diminish their individuality. Each victim had his own ambitions, personality, and relationships. Some had established careers, while others were still building their future. Some had lived in London for years, Others had arrived more recently. Their experiences differed, but each represented a life interrupted rather than a statistic to be counted. This distinction matters because true crime can unintentionally shift attention toward the offender at the expense of those harmed. A responsible account should instead acknowledge that the lasting consequence of these crimes was not the notoriety of the killer, but the permanent absence experienced by the people left behind. As investigators continued gathering information, they faced another challenge common to serial investigations. Individual cases are often assigned to different teams or develop at different speeds depending on available evidence. Without a clear connection, separate homicides may initially appear unrelated. Detectives therefore evaluate each case on its own merits before considering whether broader patterns exist. At this stage of the investigation, that broader picture had not yet fully emerged. The available evidence pointed toward violent crimes, but not yet toward a single offender responsible for multiple attacks. As a result, families waited for answers while investigators continued examining each case with the information they had at the time. Looking back, it is easy to see where the investigations would eventually converge. Looking forward, from the perspective of detectives working in the mid-1980s, that certainty did not yet exist. Every interview, every forensic examination, and every new lead represented another attempt to understand events that were still incomplete. The victims never had the opportunity to tell investigators what had happened. Their final movements had to be reconstructed through physical evidence, witness accounts, and careful investigative work. That process required persistence, and it would eventually become one of the defining features of the case. As the investigation progressed, detectives slowly realized that these tragedies might not be isolated after all. Small details that once appeared unrelated began to align. Patterns started to emerge where previously there had been only individual cases. Those developments would ultimately reshape the direction of the investigation and lead police toward a suspect who had, until then, remained hidden within the ordinary life of one of Europe's busiest cities. As the connections between the cases slowly became clearer, one of the most difficult tasks for investigators was reconstructing not only what had happened, but who these men had been before their deaths. A criminal investigation naturally focuses on evidence. Dates, locations, statements, physical findings. Every detail must be examined carefully because the smallest piece of information can change the direction of a case. But behind every piece of evidence was a person whose life had existed long before investigators ever learned their name. That reality remained important throughout the investigation. The victims were not simply individuals connected by the circumstances of their deaths. They were members of a community that had its own history, challenges, and sources of strength. Their lives unfolded during a period of significant change in Britain, a time when social attitudes were shifting but acceptance remained incomplete. Many gay men of that generation had spent years navigating questions of identity, privacy, and belonging. For some, London represented a chance to live more openly. The city offered anonymity, but it also offered connection. A person who felt isolated elsewhere could find friendship among people with similar experiences. Familiar streets and familiar venues became places where individuals could build relationships and create a sense of home. That sense of community was especially meaningful during the uncertainty of the 1980s. The AIDS crisis had created fear and grief across many communities. Medical understanding was still developing, and misinformation often created additional suffering. Many people faced not only concerns about health but also the painful reality of discrimination and misunderstanding. In that environment, social spaces became more than places of entertainment. They were places where people could find support. A person entering a pub or club was often not simply looking for a drink. They might have been looking for conversation after a difficult week. They might have wanted to meet friends. They might have wanted a few hours where they could feel completely comfortable being themselves. Those ordinary human needs are what made the crimes particularly devastating. The offender did not operate in a world of obvious danger. He moved within spaces built around trust and connection. The very qualities that allowed people to form friendships also created opportunities for someone willing to exploit that trust. For investigators, understanding this environment was essential. They needed to understand not only the movements of a suspect but also the lives of the people affected. They needed to know where victims spent time, who they knew, and what routines might have brought them into contact with the same individual. This process required listening. Friends and acquaintances became important sources of information. They provided details that official records could never capture. They described personalities, habits, and relationships. They helped transform names in a case file back into human beings. A person who was missing from a social gathering was not simply absent. A workplace without a familiar colleague was not simply operating differently. A group of friends without one familiar voice was experiencing a loss that could not be measured through paperwork. These personal accounts also helped investigators understand the wider impact of the crimes. Fear spread beyond the immediate families of the victims. Members of the community began reconsidering situations they had previously viewed as harmless. Meeting new people, accepting invitations, and spending time in familiar social spaces suddenly carried a new sense of uncertainty. However, fear did not erase resilience. Communities affected by violence often respond by supporting one another. People share information. They look after friends. They encourage others to report concerns. They demand answers from authorities. In difficult circumstances, collective action becomes a way of protecting the people still present. The eventual identification of Michael Lupo did not change what had already happened. It could not return lost lives or remove the pain carried by those who survived. But understanding how the investigation developed offers an important reminder. Solving crimes is not only about identifying an offender. It is also about restoring recognition to those whose lives were interrupted. The victims remain the heart of this story. Their importance does not come from their connection to a notorious criminal case. Their importance comes from the fact that they were people with futures that should have continued. Every investigation eventually reaches a courtroom. Every suspect eventually faces judgment. But before there can be justice, there must first be remembrance. The men affected by this case deserve to be remembered not only for the tragedy that ended their lives, but for the lives they lived before that moment. They were part of London. They were part of their communities. They were part of the families and friendships that continued carrying their memories forward long after the investigation ended. And as detectives moved closer to understanding the pattern behind the crimes, their work was driven by more than the search for a suspect. It was driven by the need to answer questions that had haunted those left behind. What happened? Who was responsible? And how could it have been prevented? Those questions would guide the next stage of the investigation, as scattered details began forming a clearer picture of the events that had taken place across London. Min setip tuc cac fan saw theo kung nip ku ne kiban yu kor, 4a, 4b, 4c. The most frightening aspect of a hidden pattern is that, while it is happening, almost no one recognizes it. To the people living through those nights in London during the mid-1980s, there was no clear beginning to a serial murder investigation. There was no single moment when the city stopped and realized a dangerous individual was moving among them. There were only separate events, separate concerns, and separate families trying to understand why someone they cared about had suddenly disappeared from their lives. The victims did not know they were connected. The people around them did not know they were connected. Even the investigators working on the earliest cases did not yet have the complete picture. That is how many serial cases develop. The pattern exists before anyone has a name for it. Before Michael Lupo became identified as the person responsible for a series of attacks, he was simply another person moving through the same social environments as countless others. He entered places where people gathered, where strangers could become acquaintances, and where conversations often began without suspicion. The settings were ordinary. The interactions were ordinary. The danger was hidden inside something that appeared completely normal. For those who encountered him, the beginning of the evening likely did not feel unusual. That is an important detail when examining cases like this. The moments before a crime are often not dramatic. They are filled with everyday choices. Someone decides to continue a conversation. Someone accepts an invitation. Someone believes they are spending time with another person who seems interested in knowing them. Trust rarely disappears instantly. It is usually built gradually. A few words exchanged. A shared laugh. A sense of familiarity. Those small moments create the foundation of human connection, but in the hands of someone with harmful intentions, they can become opportunities for manipulation. Investigators examining Lupo's crimes later found that his approach relied heavily on this element of trust. He was not known for creating public disturbances or drawing attention to himself. Instead, he appeared capable of blending into social situations and presenting himself as someone approachable. That ability made the investigation more difficult. A stranger who behaves aggressively often creates witnesses. People remember the person who caused a scene in a crowded location. They remember raised voices, obvious conflict, or unusual behavior. A person who appears calm creates fewer reasons for anyone nearby to pay attention. This reality shaped the early stages of the case. Detectives were not simply searching for physical evidence. They were trying to understand human interactions that had occurred in private or semi-private moments. They needed to identify connections between people who had no reason to believe their experiences were related. The victims' final known movements became critical. Investigators looked at where they had been, who they had spoken with, and whether any details repeated across different cases. Each interview added another piece of information. Each conversation with friends or acquaintances provided another glimpse into the hours before tragedy occurred. But investigations rarely move in a straight line. For every useful detail, there are countless details that lead nowhere. A name mentioned in an interview may belong to someone completely uninvolved. A memory from weeks earlier may seem important but prove irrelevant. A possible connection may disappear after further examination. Detectives must work through uncertainty. They must resist the temptation to force evidence into a conclusion before the facts support it. In the Michael Lupo investigation, the challenge was made greater by the environment in which the crimes occurred. The social spaces connected to the victims were active and constantly changing. Many people passed through the same locations. Many conversations happened every night. Memories faded quickly, and identifying one person among hundreds required patience. Meanwhile, the city continued moving. The same streets where people had gathered for friendship and entertainment remained busy. The same venues welcomed customers. The same neighborhoods followed their usual routines. But beneath that normality, fear began to develop. People started asking questions. Were these incidents connected? Was there someone targeting members of the community? Could the person responsible still be nearby? Fear changes the way people see familiar places. A street that once represented freedom can begin to feel uncertain. A casual meeting can suddenly carry new concerns. A stranger's friendliness may be viewed differently. For a community already facing anxiety because of wider social issues, the possibility of a predator operating within familiar spaces created another layer of distress. Yet fear alone does not solve crimes. Evidence does. And evidence takes time. The investigation required detectives to move carefully, collecting information from different sources and comparing details that initially appeared unrelated. The process depended on persistence rather than a single dramatic discovery. At this stage, the most important question was not simply who committed these crimes. It was whether one person was responsible for all of them. That question would eventually change the entire direction of the investigation. Because once separate tragedies become connected, the search changes completely. Police are no longer looking for answers inside one event. They are searching for a pattern, a method, and ultimately a person whose actions have affected multiple lives. For the families waiting for answers, that connection could not come soon enough. For investigators, it represented the beginning of a much larger challenge. The scattered pieces of the case were slowly moving closer together. And somewhere within those pieces was the identity of the man they were looking for. Min Setip Tuc Forbi Kiban Ukor. As investigators continued examining the events connected to Michael Lupo, One of the greatest difficulties was understanding the moments that existed between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy. A person's final hours are often reconstructed from fragments. A conversation remembered by a friend. A routine confirmed by a colleague. A place visited earlier in the evening. A detail that seemed meaningless at the time but later gained importance. Unlike the certainty that comes after a case is solved, investigations in progress are built on uncertainty. Detectives must work with incomplete information. They must ask questions without knowing which answers will matter. They must examine possibilities while accepting that many of them will eventually lead nowhere. For the people closest to the victims, however, there was no sense of investigation as a process. There was only absence. There was the unanswered telephone. The missing conversation. The expectation that someone would eventually walk through the door. When that expectation disappeared, families and friends were left facing a reality that no investigation could immediately repair. This is one of the most painful 4C. L aspects of violent crime. The investigation moves forward because it must, but grief does not follow the same timeline. Police officers search for facts. Loved ones search for meaning. Those two journeys overlap, but they are never identical. As more information emerged, detectives began examining whether the crimes shared common characteristics. Similarities in circumstances, victim profiles, and locations can become significant in cases involving possible serial offenders. A single event may appear random, but repeated patterns can reveal intention. Pattern recognition is one of the most important tools in criminal investigation. It is also one of the most difficult. A pattern cannot be declared simply because two events appear similar. Investigators must determine whether similarities are meaningful or accidental. They must separate coincidence from connection. In the case surrounding Michael Lupo, that process required careful comparison of multiple incidents over time. Investigators reviewed available evidence, spoke with people connected to the victims, and attempted to understand whether the same individual could have been involved. The possibility that one person was responsible for several attacks changed the nature of the investigation completely. A single homicide already represents an enormous challenge. A series of connected crimes creates an entirely different level of urgency. Investigators are no longer only trying to understand what happened in the past. They are also trying to prevent what might happen in the future. That pressure affects everyone involved. Detectives understand that every unanswered question may represent another opportunity for a dangerous person to continue. Communities experience uncertainty because they do not know where the threat exists. Families of victims carry the additional pain of knowing that others may still be at risk. During this period, information becomes incredibly valuable. A small detail shared by one person can help explain another person's experience. A memory that seemed insignificant may provide a missing link. A survivor's account can become especially important because it offers something investigators rarely receive: the perspective of someone who encountered the offender and lived to describe it. In many criminal cases, survivors become the voices that allow hidden patterns to be discovered. Their experiences require immense courage to share. Recounting frightening events means returning to moments that many people would rather never revisit. It requires answering difficult questions, remembering details under pressure, and trusting that those memories can help protect others. For investigators, such testimony can be a turning point. For the community, it can transform fear into action. As the investigation progressed, the name Michael Lupo gradually moved from being unknown to becoming central to police inquiries. The man who had previously existed within the background of ordinary social life was now being examined through a very different lens. The contrast was striking. To some, he had appeared simply as another person in London's crowded nightlife. To investigators, he had become the subject of a search for answers involving multiple victims. This difference between appearance and reality became one of the defining themes of the case. People often imagine that dangerous individuals announce themselves through obvious behavior. They expect warning signs that are easy to recognize. But many investigations reveal something far more complicated: the ability to appear ordinary can be one of the reasons a person avoids suspicion. That does not mean warning signs never exist. It means that understanding human behavior requires looking beyond appearances. The investigation into Michael Lupo would eventually depend on moving past assumptions and examining facts. It would require cooperation between investigators, witnesses, and survivors. It would require connecting separate events into a single narrative. Most importantly, it required recognizing that the victims' experiences were not isolated tragedies. They were parts of a larger story. A story that was becoming clearer with every new piece of evidence. And as that picture emerged, the search for the person responsible entered a new phase, one where investigators were no longer asking whether the crimes were connected, but how they could prove who was behind them. Min se tip tuc 4c kiban u kor. The investigation into Michael Lupo was not built around one dramatic moment. It developed through the slow accumulation of information, the kind of patient work that rarely receives attention outside police departments but often determines whether a case is solved or forgotten. Behind every major breakthrough in a criminal investigation are countless hours that never appear in headlines. Interviews conducted again and again. Records examined line by line. Details compared until similarities become impossible to ignore. Investigators must often live with uncertainty for long periods of time. They know something serious has happened, but they do not yet know the full explanation. They understand that someone is responsible, but they may not know who that person is. They may suspect a connection between cases, but suspicion alone cannot bring justice. Evidence must carry the weight. During this period, the crimes connected to Lupo continued to challenge investigators because the events had not initially presented themselves as part of one larger pattern. Each incident existed within its own circumstances. Each victim had his own life. Each location contained its own questions. The task was to discover what linked them. That process required detectives to look beyond the obvious. A victim's final known movements mattered, but so did the wider context surrounding those movements. Who was present? Who had access? Who had opportunities? Were there repeated behaviors that suggested the involvement of the same person? These questions transformed individual cases into a broader investigation. One of the most important developments in any serial crime investigation is the realization that the offender's actions often create a pattern, even when the offender attempts to remain hidden. The choices made by a criminal can reveal consistency. The places they visit, the people they approach, and the methods they use can leave behind a recognizable signature. The difficulty is recognizing that signature before more people are harmed. For the London community affected by these events, the uncertainty created a difficult emotional atmosphere. People who had once moved through familiar spaces without concern began to view those environments differently. Ordinary interactions became moments of reflection. Meeting someone new carried additional questions. Who is this person? Can they be trusted? Is there something I should notice? Fear can change a community, but so can awareness. Friends began looking out for one another more closely. Information became more important. People paid attention to concerns they might previously have dismissed. The same networks that had provided friendship and support now also became channels for communication and protection. This collective response was significant because investigations do not happen separately from the communities they serve. Police rely on people willing to come forward. Witnesses rely on authorities to take their experiences seriously. Survivors rely on the belief that speaking out can prevent further harm. The relationship between investigators and the public can determine whether hidden truths remain hidden or eventually come to light. In the case of Michael Lupo, one of the most important developments would come from someone who survived an encounter with him. A survivor's account can change the direction of an entire investigation because it provides something that evidence alone cannot always provide, a direct human connection to the person responsible. Physical evidence can show that a crime occurred. A witness can help explain who was there. The courage required to provide that information cannot be underestimated. Survivors often carry memories that are painful to revisit. They must describe moments they would rather leave behind. They must answer questions from strangers who need details, even when those details are difficult to share. Yet those accounts can become essential. They can give investigators a description. They can establish timelines. They can reveal behaviors that connect separate events. They can turn uncertainty into a clearer path forward. As investigators gathered more information, the image of Michael Lupo began to change. The person who had previously appeared to others as simply another individual in London's social environment was now being viewed through the evidence collected during the investigation. The contrast between those two images became central to understanding the case. Public appearance and private actions existed in complete opposition. The man known in some circles through ordinary interactions was the same person investigators were examining in connection with serious crimes. This contrast is one reason cases like this remain difficult to understand. People naturally search for explanations that make dangerous individuals easy to identify. They want to believe that harmful behavior always comes with obvious signs. But many offenders are able to maintain ordinary relationships and routines, making recognition far more difficult. The investigation would eventually move toward a decisive stage. The questions were becoming more focused. The evidence was becoming more organized. The possibility of identifying the person responsible was no longer distant. But before justice could be achieved, investigators still needed to overcome one final challenge: transforming suspicion into proof. A person could be suspected. A theory could be developed. A pattern could be recognized. But in a courtroom, only evidence would matter. And the next stage of the investigation would depend on finding the evidence strong enough to reveal the truth. The discovery of a crime scene is often described as the moment when a case begins. In reality, it is usually the moment when investigators realize how much they do not yet know. A location can reveal what happened, but it cannot immediately explain why it happened. It can provide evidence, but it cannot speak for the person whose life ended there. Every object left behind becomes part of a larger question. Every detail must be considered carefully. Every assumption must be tested. For detectives examining the crimes connected to Michael Lupo, the early stages of investigation were defined by that uncertainty. There was no single piece of evidence that instantly revealed the complete picture. There was no immediate answer waiting to be discovered. Instead, investigators were faced with separate tragedies that required careful examination before any connection could be established. The work began with the basics. Who was the victim? Who had last seen them? Where had they been? Who might have had contact with them? What information could explain the circumstances surrounding their death? These questions may sound simple, but each one opens a complicated path. A person's final hours are rarely documented perfectly. Memories are incomplete. Witnesses may remember certain details clearly while forgetting others. Small events that seem unimportant at the time can later become significant. Investigators must reconstruct a timeline from fragments. A conversation remembered weeks later. A place someone visited. A person they encountered. A routine that suddenly stopped. In homicide investigations, the victim's final movements often become one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Detectives attempt to understand not only where someone was, but how they moved through the world before their death. Their habits, friendships, and daily routines can reveal opportunities for contact with a suspect. In this case, investigators began recognizing similarities between incidents involving men from London's gay community. The victims had different personal histories, but certain circumstances surrounding their deaths suggested that they might not have been random events. That possibility changed everything. A single murder requires investigators to identify one person responsible for one act. A series of connected crimes requires something more complex: understanding a pattern of behavior. Patterns are not always obvious. They are often hidden beneath details that appear unrelated. One victim's social connections may seem completely separate from another's. One location may appear unrelated to another. One witness may have information that only becomes meaningful when compared with evidence from another case. The process of connecting these pieces requires patience. It also requires avoiding assumptions. Investigators cannot simply decide that two crimes are connected because they share certain similarities. They must establish links through evidence. They must determine whether similarities reveal a common offender or merely reflect circumstances that happen naturally within a large city. London's size made that challenge even greater. Millions of people moved through the city every day. Thousands of conversations took place every night. Hundreds of strangers crossed paths in the same neighborhoods. Identifying one person's movements among so many possibilities required careful work. The social environment also created unique difficulties. Many of the places connected to the victims were busy venues where people came and went constantly. Witnesses might remember a face without knowing a name. Someone might recall a conversation without remembering the exact time. A person who seemed insignificant in the moment could later become an important part of the investigation. This is why investigators often return to the same questions repeatedly. Not because they doubt witnesses. Because memory changes. A person's understanding of an event can shift after learning new information. Details that seemed ordinary may become clearer once a larger pattern appears. For friends of the victims, those memories carried a different kind of weight. They were not searching for evidence. They were searching for understanding. They remembered the people they had lost before those people became part of a criminal case. They remembered personalities rather than police reports. They remembered conversations rather than timelines. A friend might remember someone's favorite place to eat. A colleague might remember their daily routine. A family member might remember the last ordinary conversation they shared. These details rarely solve a case by themselves, but they restore something important. They remind investigators that behind every file number is a complete human life. As the investigation continued, detectives worked to identify whether one person could explain multiple tragedies. The possibility was disturbing, but it also offered a direction. If the same offender was responsible, understanding one crime could help explain another. The search moved from individual incidents toward a larger question. Who had the opportunity, access, and ability to move between these different events without being recognized? That question would eventually lead investigators closer to Michael Lupo. But at this stage, the evidence still had to be carefully assembled. A suspicion was not enough. A theory was not enough. A name was not enough. Justice would depend on proving the connection between a suspect and the crimes. And that required finding the details that could transform uncertainty into certainty. As investigators continued examining the evidence surrounding the deaths connected to Michael Lupo, the crime scenes began to reveal an uncomfortable truth. The answers they needed would not come from one dramatic discovery, but from a careful examination of details that initially appeared ordinary. In serious criminal investigations, evidence rarely arrives with an explanation attached. A fingerprint does not announce whose hand left it behind. A witness statement does not automatically reveal every hidden detail. A timeline does not immediately explain a person's intentions. Investigators must take fragments and slowly build a complete picture. That process requires discipline because the smallest mistake can send an investigation in the wrong direction. A person who appears suspicious may have a perfectly innocent explanation. A detail that seems insignificant may later become essential. Every possibility must be considered, but every conclusion must be supported. As detectives reviewed the information available, they focused on the connections between the victims and their final known movements. They examined the circumstances surrounding each case and searched for similarities that could indicate a common offender. The idea that several crimes could be linked was both a challenge and an opportunity. It was a challenge because it meant the offender had potentially remained unidentified across multiple incidents. Each additional unanswered question represented another moment when the person responsible could avoid detection. But it was also an opportunity because patterns can reveal what individual cases cannot. A person may successfully hide one action. Maintaining the same behavior repeatedly becomes far more difficult. Investigators began looking beyond individual events and toward behavior. How did the offender approach people? What environments did he choose? What circumstances allowed him to gain trust? Were there repeated choices that suggested planning rather than coincidence? These questions were essential because the person they were searching for had not forced his way into the lives of the victims as an obvious threat. He appeared to enter through ordinary social interactions. That made the investigation less about finding a stranger and more about identifying someone who had been able to appear familiar. For detectives, this was a difficult psychological challenge. Human beings naturally remember unusual behavior more clearly than ordinary behavior. Someone shouting in public attracts attention. Someone acting aggressively becomes memorable. But someone behaving politely, calmly, and confidently may leave almost no impression at all. This meant witnesses often had to search their memories carefully. A face seen briefly. A conversation overheard. A person standing nearby. A name mentioned casually. The process could feel like searching through thousands of pieces of a puzzle without knowing which pieces belonged together. Meanwhile, the wider community continued dealing with uncertainty. News of the crimes created concern among people who shared similar social spaces as the victims. Places that had previously represented connection and safety now carried a new sense of caution. Friends looked after one another more carefully. Conversations changed. People began sharing information about anything unusual they had experienced. Fear affected communities differently. Some people withdrew. Others became more determined to support one another. The desire for answers grew stronger. For law enforcement, that cooperation was vital. Investigations involving multiple victims often depend on people being willing to share information that may seem minor or embarrassing. A person may hesitate because they believe a detail is unimportant, or because they worry about being judged. Yet investigations are often solved through exactly those details. A small memory can become a major lead. A forgotten interaction can become a connection. A person who believed they had nothing useful to offer may provide the information that changes everything. This was especially true when survivors became involved in the investigation. Unlike evidence recovered after an event, a survivor can provide direct information about an encounter with the offender. Their account can help investigators understand behavior, identify patterns, and narrow the search. However, giving such information comes with an enormous emotional cost. Survivors are not simply sources of evidence. They are people who have experienced something traumatic and must often revisit those experiences in order to help an investigation move forward. Their cooperation requires courage and resilience. As investigators gathered more information, the image of the person they were searching for became clearer. They were not looking for someone who appeared obviously dangerous. They were looking for someone who could move through familiar environments without attracting suspicion. Someone who understood how to create a sense of comfort. Someone who could separate his public identity from his private actions. The investigation was gradually moving closer to identifying Michael Lupo as the central figure behind the crimes. But suspicion alone could not bring justice. Police needed evidence that connected him directly to the offenses. They needed facts strong enough to withstand examination in court. They needed to move beyond possibility and establish proof. The difference between those two things defines every major criminal investigation. A theory can begin a case. Evidence must finish it. And as detectives continued following the trail left behind by a series of seemingly separate tragedies, the investigation approached the moment when scattered clues would finally begin pointing toward one name.